Imagine you're a young Norwegian in 1942. Your country is occupied. German soldiers walk the streets, money is tight, food is rationed, and everybody is watching everybody else. One day, a poster goes up, promising good pay, adventure, and the chance to fight Bolshevism and defend the Nordic race in an elite German unit. Some men said yes. In this video, we're going to ask a hard question. Why did some Scandinavians choose to fight for Hitler? Not all Scandinavians, not most, but enough that it left a deep scar on Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. To understand that choice, we need to look at several layers. Nazi racial ideas about Nordic blood, money and economic pressure, fear of the Soviet Union and communism, life under occupation, military career opportunities, old Germanic ties between Germany and Scandinavia, and finally, what happened to these volunteers after the war? The answer isn't simple or comfortable, but it helps us see how ordinary people can end up on the wrong side of history. From the beginning, the Nazis were obsessed with race. In their worldview, so-called Nordic people sat right at the top. Hitler claimed that the Nordic race made up more than half of the German people, and he looked at Scandinavia as a kind of racial heartland, cold, northern, pure. This idea did two things. First, it flattered many Scandinavians by telling them they weren't second-class allies, but racial cousins. Second, it gave the Nazis a reason to build special Germanic units featuring volunteers from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. Propaganda leaned hard into this. Posters and films were full of Viking ships, runes, Norse gods, and blonde warriors. The message was simple: you are the modern Vikings. Join us and fight to defend the superior Nordic race. For some young men, the promise of being part of an elite brotherhood of Aryan warriors was attractive, especially when it came with sharp uniforms, special symbols, and the idea of serving in Germanic SS units that were treated as elite. But ideology wasn't the only reason. For many people, it was about survival. When Germany occupied Norway, the economy was wrecked. Trade collapsed, production fell, and a huge share of what was produced was taken by the Germans. In that chaos, German projects suddenly looked like gold mines. Construction sites and military projects often paid up to 3 times pre-war wages. Food and goods were easier to get through German-connected work. In some cases, refusing to cooperate meant losing your job or your business. For some men, joining German forces or the Waffen-SS meant a steady wage, better rations, clothing, housing, medical care, and money they could send home. It wasn't always a clear "I love Hitler" decision. Sometimes it was "I need to feed my family. This is the only job that pays." Even in officially neutral Sweden, economic ties to Germany were strong. Sweden exported iron ore, and German capital had influence in many companies. That didn't automatically turn Swedes into Nazis, but it did create a sense that doing business with Germany was normal, and for some, necessary. When high wages and promises weren't enough, German authorities and local collaborators could add pressure through forced labor, threats of property confiscation, and harassment. All of this made people more vulnerable to recruitment. If you had asked many volunteers why they signed up, they wouldn't have said, "Because I love Nazism." They would have said, "Because I hate communism." In the 1930s and 1940s, fear of the Soviet Union and of communism was huge across Europe, including Scandinavia. The anti-Comintern Pact, led by Germany and Japan, presented the fight against communism as an international mission. And then came the Winter War of 1939-1940, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland. Volunteers from all over Scandinavia went to help the Finns. That conflict left deep marks and made the Soviet Union look even more dangerous. For many conservatives, landowners, business leaders, and ordinary believers, the Soviet Union looked like a godless dictatorship, an enemy of private property, a threat to religion and traditional values, and a danger sitting right next door. Governments and police forces in Scandinavia cracked down on communists. Communist papers were censored or confiscated. Activists were watched, arrested, or placed in internment camps. In some places, communist organizations were treated far more harshly than right-wing or even openly Nazi groups. Nazi propaganda knew exactly how to use this fear. It repeated again and again that Bolshevism was evil, godless, and inhuman, and that the Red Army was coming for Europe. Germany claimed it was the only power strong enough to stop them. For young men who were afraid of Soviet expansion, the Eastern Front could look like a defensive war and a chance to protect Europe. Joining the Waffen-SS, or German army, could feel in their minds like choosing the lesser evil. That doesn't excuse what they joined, but it helps explain why fighting the Reds felt to some like a noble cause, even when it meant wearing the uniform of Hitler's SS. Now put yourself back in occupied Norway. It's not just German soldiers you're afraid of, it's also your neighbours. The collaborationist party, National Samling, under Vidkun Quisling, built dense surveillance networks. Local informers watched who talked to whom. People reported on co-workers, teachers, and priests. Rumours could ruin your career or get you arrested. If you resisted, there were real costs. More than 1,000 teachers refused to teach Nazi curriculum. Hundreds were arrested, and many were sent to harsh labour camps in the Arctic. Parents who kept their children out of Nazi youth groups risked losing jobs, ration cards, or even their children. Refusing to cooperate with occupation authorities could mean losing your license to work, having your property taken, or going to jail. Daily life was full of small rules that reminded you who was in charge. You might be forced to attend parades or propaganda events. You could be punished for minor signs of disrespect towards German soldiers. Newspapers and radio were heavily censored, limiting what you knew about the wider war and about Nazi crimes. Registration systems and church records were misused. Lists were created of Jews, political opponents, and unreliable people. In some cases, church institutions helped block marriages or track people the Nazis considered undesirable, especially Jews. On the other side, resistance groups like XU in Norway tried to fight back by collecting information on German movements, sabotaging registry offices, and smuggling news to the Allies. Caught between occupation and resistance, ordinary families felt constant pressure. If you collaborated, you might survive the war but be hated afterwards. If you resisted, you risked your job, your freedom, and your family's safety. In that climate, some people stepped towards collaboration, including military service, out of fear and a desire to protect those closest to them. Another big draw was the promise of a real military career. Scandinavian countries had small armies and short conscription periods. The German forces, by contrast, offered 3-year contracts, clear promotion paths from private to non-commissioned officer, and faster advancement, sometimes within 18 to 24 months. Volunteers were promised specialized training in tanks, artillery, communications, and mountain and Arctic warfare, as well as better pay and benefits compared with staying at home. For young men who wanted adventure, status, or a way out of unemployment, that mattered. Within the Waffen-SS and Germanic SS, several units had Scandinavian elements. The Viking Division, often called the Viking Division, started as a Germanic unit with volunteers from across Europe, including Scandinavia. Regiments such as Norge and Denmark drew in Norwegian, Swedish and Danish volunteers. The 6th SS Mountain Division, Nord, trained men in Arctic and mountain warfare, including skiing, climbing and survival in extreme cold. Germans still made up the majority in these units, but propaganda highlighted Nordic volunteers as elite racial comrades, not just foreign helpers. From a recruit's point of view, joining could mean wearing a feared and respected uniform, getting advanced training they could never access at home, escaping a boring or dead-end job, and joining what looked like a brotherhood of warriors. The reality, of course, was brutal. These units fought in some of the fiercest battles on the Eastern Front and took heavy casualties. But at the moment of signing up, many volunteers saw status, pay, and excitement, not the horror that was coming. Nazi propaganda also didn't start from nothing. It built on real historical ties between Germany and Scandinavia. The Germanic language family largely formed in and around the Scandinavian peninsula in ancient times. Over centuries, migration, trade, and wars created cultural overlap, from Viking raids and settlement to medieval trade. The Hanseatic League gave German merchants and cities a strong presence in Scandinavian ports like Bergen and Copenhagen. Royal families and elites often intermarried across borders. Even in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were strong cultural and political links, with shared ideas, literature, and movements. Most people did not see this as a reason to join Hitler, but Nazi propagandists twisted it into a story of a single, greater Germanic family, with Germany as the big brother leading the fight. They portrayed Scandinavian volunteers not as traitors, but as men returning to their true ancient community. For some volunteers, this made it easier to tell themselves that they weren't betraying their country. They were fighting for a larger, shared destiny. Norway's experience became one of the most infamous stories of collaboration in the North. When Germany invaded in April 1940, Vidkun Quisling tried to seize power, calling himself Prime Minister over the radio. Later, under German occupation, he became Minister-President and head of the collaborationist regime. His party, National Samling, tried to control schools and rewrite the curriculum, bring children into Nazi-style youth organizations, use church and state rituals to spread Nazi ideas, and promote the claim that Germany was protecting Norway from Britain and the Soviet Union. Quisling wrapped much of this in Norwegian symbols, flags, national myths, and talk of sovereignty, even while serving German interests. But he never fully won the people. Around 12,000 of 14,000 teachers refused to cooperate with his reforms. The Norwegian church pushed back against attempts to rewrite Christian doctrine to fit Nazi ideas. By the end of the war, Quisling's name had become a synonym for traitor, a word we still use today. One useful comparison is Norway versus Denmark. Norway had about 15,000 military volunteers for German forces, roughly 0.5% of the population, and around 43,000 members of National Samling, about 1.5% of Norwegians. The country experienced direct occupation, a puppet government under Quisling, and Norwegian police involvement in deportations of Jews. Denmark's situation looked different. Denmark kept its own government until 1943, under strong German pressure but with more formal independence. Danish institutions, especially the civil service and the resistance movement, did more to protect Danish Jews and to limit collaboration. There were Danish volunteers in the Waffen-SS, but the overall scale of political collaboration was lower relative to population. The key point is that how Germany ruled each country shaped how people behaved. A harsh, direct occupation in Norway produced one pattern of collaboration and resistance. A softer occupation in Denmark produced another. That doesn't erase personal responsibility, but it shows how context mattered. So, why did some Scandinavians fight for Hitler? It wasn't just one reason. It was a mix of flattering racial ideology that called them perfect Aryans, economic desperation, and the promise of high wages and stability, fear of the Soviet Union, and deep anti-communist feeling, social pressure, surveillance, and fear for family safety under occupation, career opportunities, and the lure of elite status in Waffen-SS units. Old cultural ties repackaged as a greater Germanic family, and political choices by local leaders and occupiers that opened or closed doors to collaboration. Most people in Scandinavia did not join the Nazis. Many resisted, quietly or openly, and some paid with their lives. But a minority did enlist, and their choices still shape how these countries think about guilt, responsibility, and identity in wartime. Understanding their motives doesn't mean excusing them. It means facing the uncomfortable truth that under enough pressure, fear, poverty, propaganda, and hope for a better life, ordinary people can end up on the wrong side of history. Now imagine you're a Norwegian SS volunteer coming home in 1945. You've survived the Eastern Front. You're tired, dirty, maybe wounded. You step off the ship or train expecting an awkward reunion, maybe some angry looks. And instead, you see police waiting for you with handcuffs. For many Scandinavian men who fought for Germany, that was the start of the rest of their lives. Next, we're going to follow them after the war. The arrests, the trials, the prison sentences, the loss of civil rights, the shame put on their families, and the long silence that followed. We'll look at Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, because each country handled these men differently, and that shaped how they were remembered. Let's start in Norway, because that's where the most dramatic purge happened. As soon as Germany surrendered in May 1945, Norwegian authorities began what they called the treason settlement. Within just a few days, around 28,000 people were arrested for suspected collaboration with the Germans. By 1946, thousands were still in custody, waiting for their cases to be decided. Over the next few years, courts worked through tens of thousands of files. Around 50,000 Norwegians were eventually found guilty of some form of treason or collaboration, most of them members or helpers of the National Samling Party. For SS volunteers, the main charge was usually simple: treason. They had sworn loyalty to German forces and fought in uniform for the enemy. Norwegian prosecutors treated that as a political crime against the state, not as a war crime. That means they weren't tried for what they did on the Eastern Front in detail. They were tried for the fact that they had gone there at all. The punishments varied. Some got prison sentences, others were hit with huge fines. Many lost their civil rights for a period, things like the right to vote, to hold public office, or to work in certain jobs. Historians later called them citizen outcasts because they were technically free but treated as half-citizens in their own country. At the top of the pyramid were people like Vidkun Quisling. He was the political face of collaboration in Norway, the man who had tried to seize power during the German invasion and then led the puppet regime. After the war, he was arrested, tried for high treason, murder and other crimes, and sentenced to death. His execution turned his name into a global synonym for traitor. In total, dozens of people were executed in Norway after the war for collaboration and related crimes, including some top officials and police officers. For ordinary SS volunteers, the punishment was usually less extreme, but the social cost could last a lifetime. Denmark's story looks similar on the surface, but the details are different. Denmark had been allowed to keep its own government until 1943, and many Danish institutions had tried to limit German demands. After liberation, Denmark passed a special law that allowed the state to prosecute people who had joined German war service or made big money cooperating with the occupiers. This law was controversial because it applied retroactively to actions taken before the law existed. Danish courts held their own collaborator trials. People who had served in the Waffen-SS or in German police units could be charged, as well as those who had profited heavily from German contracts. Over 100 people received death sentences in these treason cases, although not all were actually executed. Many more received prison terms or lost their civil rights for a set number of years. Finland had a more complicated situation. During the war, Finland had first fought against the Soviet Union in the Winter War, then later fought alongside Germany in what Finns call the Continuation War. Around 1,400 Finnish volunteers served in the Waffen-SS, mainly in the Viking Division on the Eastern Front. After the war, some of these men were investigated and removed from positions in the army and police, but Finland didn't hold a huge public purge focused on them in the same way Norway did. For decades, the official story in Finland downplayed their role in atrocities. That changed in the 2010s. In 2019, a major report by the Finnish National Archives concluded that Finnish SS volunteers had, very likely, taken part in mass shootings of Jews, civilians, and prisoners of war. This forced Finland into a painful new conversation about what its volunteers had actually done. Sweden was different again. It had stayed officially neutral, so it didn't have a large group of returning SS veterans to put on trial in the same way. Still, there were Swedes who had volunteered for German units or worked closely with Nazi organizations. Some of them were watched by security services, questioned, or quietly pushed out of important roles. But there was no massive purge or treason settlement like in Norway. So what did life look like for a former SS man after he got out of prison or finished his sentence? For many, it meant starting from a deep hole. The legal penalties were only one part of the punishment. In Norway, for example, losing your civil rights could mean you couldn't vote, work as a teacher, hold any public job, or join the army or police again for years. People might cross the street to avoid you. Old friends would stop talking to you. Employers would prefer anyone else. Even decades later, some families could still be known in their village as the family with the SS father. A lot of these men chose silence as a survival tactic. Many never told their children the full story of where they had fought and why. Some reinvented themselves as just soldiers who had been misled, or claimed they had only wanted to fight communism, not support Hitler. In some cases, that was partly true. In others, it was a way to soften their image. Historians working decades later often had to dig through letters, diaries, and foreign archives to figure out what they had really done, because the men themselves weren't talking. The stigma didn't fall only on the men who had worn German uniforms. It also hit women and children. Throughout the occupation, thousands of Scandinavian women had relationships with German soldiers. In Norway alone, estimates suggest that between 30 and 50,000 women had some kind of romantic or sexual relationship with Germans, leading to around 12,000 children. These women were given nasty labels and seen as traitors, even though most had never committed any crime. After liberation, many were punished in the streets, having their heads shaved, being beaten, or paraded and spat on, in scenes that were never part of any formal court process. Their children carried the mark too. In Norway, they were often called German kids, or worse, bullied at school, and in some cases placed in institutions. Some grew up not knowing who their father was, or knowing only that he had been a German soldier, and that this was something to be ashamed of. Many of them also learned silence as a way to protect themselves. It was only in the 21st century that governments began to officially acknowledge this injustice. In 2018, the Norwegian Prime Minister publicly apologized to these women and their children for how they had been treated after the war. This raises a hard question. Did the post-war punishments go too far or not far enough? Historians still argue about it. Some say the legal purges were necessary to show that treason had consequences and to make clear that joining the enemy would never be treated as a small mistake. Others point out that the laws were sometimes retroactive, that minor offenders were punished while some major war criminals slipped through, and that whole families were marked for life because of the decisions of one person. In Norway, scholars have shown how the loss of civil rights penalty created a class of long-term outcasts, formally punished again and again every time they tried to vote, get a license, or apply for certain jobs. There's another layer to this story: what people knew about the Holocaust and other atrocities. For a long time, many veterans claimed they had only been front-line soldiers and didn't know what was happening behind the lines. Research on Danish and Finnish volunteers has complicated that picture. Studies of Danish SS units suggest they could not have avoided seeing or hearing about the mass killings going on around them in the East. The Finnish Archives report from 2019 makes a similar point: that Finnish volunteers very likely took part in the shooting of Jews and civilians. This doesn't prove every Scandinavian SS man was a war criminal, but it does make it harder to hold on to the idea that they were simply regular soldiers on the wrong side. So what happened to the Scandinavians who fought for Hitler? Some were shot after the war. Some went to prison for years. Many lost their rights and lived as second-class citizens for a long time. Their wives, girlfriends and children were shamed and sometimes abused. Most of them tried to disappear into ordinary life, keeping quiet about the past. And for decades, their countries didn't really want to talk about them either. It was easier to celebrate resistance heroes than to look closely at the volunteers who had chosen the other side. But history doesn't stay buried forever. As archives opened and new generations of historians started asking different questions, these stories came back. Norway had to face the full complexity of its treason trials. Finland had to admit that its SS volunteers were linked to the Holocaust. Denmark had to balance its pride in saving most of its Jews with the fact that some Danes had eagerly joined the Nazi war in the East. In the end, this is not just a story about punishments. It's a story about memory. How do you live in a country where some people joined the occupier while others resisted, and many just tried to get by? How do you treat the children of collaborators? How long should a person carry a political crime? And who gets to decide which stories are told and which are quietly forgotten?